Hello, my name is Łukasz Mol, and I'm one of the curators of the cycle of seminars called Plebs, the Commons and Alternatives to Capitalism, organized by Biennale Warszawa. Together with Katarzyna Czeczot and Michał Pospiszil, we have prepared a set of lectures by great guests, renowned scholars from abroad and from Poland. Of course, we would prefer to meet all of you guys in Warsaw in person, but unfortunately, we have to meet online. You can check the schedule for the whole semester at the website of Biennale Warszawa. And before we start today, I have one technical announcement to make that our meeting is recorded and it will be uploaded to the internet afterwards. If you decide to participate in our discussion after the lecture with your screen and with your voice, we will interpret it as the form of consent for the use of your presence in further publication. And today, I have the great pleasure and privilege to host the meeting with Professor Marcus Rediker, American historian from the University of Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania. I have to say that it was our big wish to invite Marcus Rediker for the lecture for Polish audience. His works on the history of Atlantic proletariat, plebeian struggles for the commons, and transcultural radicalism had huge impact on the idea behind our seminars. It is very unfortunate that Marcus Rediker books are currently untranslated to Polish, beside the short excerpt from The Many-Headed Hydra, the book that Marcus Rediker co-authored with Peter Linebaugh. This excerpt appeared in one of the issues of the journal Praktyka Teoretyczna, but we are already working on that, on translation of the whole book, because we believe that the history of revolutionary Atlantic is fundamental for proper understanding of the concept of the plebs and the concept of the commons. And this history is full of ideas and practices that can inspire us in seeking for the alternatives to contemporary capitalism as well. Today we will have a chance to grasp the part of this history thanks to the lecture. Professor Rediker prepared a talk around his latest book, The Fearless Benjamin Lay, the Quaker dwarf who became first revolutionary abolitionist, and he will concentrate on the issues that are very closely related to the topic of our seminar cycle, like revolutionary commoning and plebeian alternative to capitalism. As a reader of the book, I'm sure that it will be an exciting lecture. After the lecture, please stay with us. We will have time for questions and discussion. You can participate in the discussion at Zoom meeting, or you can write your questions at our Facebook profile. Your interventions can refer strictly to the lecture or to Marcus Rediker's work in general. And now I will leave you with our guest. Marcus, thank you once again for accepting our invitation and being with us today. I give you the floor, or rather, I give you the screen.
Thank you very much, Lukasz. It's a great pleasure to be with you. Thanks to you for the invitation. Thanks also to Ella for making all the arrangements. And thanks to the people who run the Warsaw Biennale. It is my pleasure to be here. I'm very happy to have a chance to speak with you about a historical figure named Benjamin Lay, who I think might be the most interesting person you've never heard of. And let me explain what I mean by that. Benjamin Lay was born in 1682. He lived until 1759, so he's essentially a man of the early 18th century. And I want to give you a sense of just how radical a figure he was. Okay, I want to set the scene. Benjamin Lay is a Quaker. I don't know how well Quakers are known in Poland, but this is a radical offshoot of the Protestant movement. It developed in England in the 1650s. Benjamin is a Quaker, and he is in Philadelphia, and he goes to a big meeting of Quakers in the year 1738. Now, Quakers at this time own a lot of slaves. They became very wealthy in the New World, and they did what all other wealthy people did. They used their money to buy slaves. But Benjamin was already very much opposed to slavery. He had become an abolitionist 20 years earlier. So he goes to this big meeting of Quakers, and it's especially important that the wealthiest Quakers were there, the big slave owners. So he goes to this meeting, and he prepares for this meeting by dressing in a military uniform, as if he were a soldier. Now, this is unusual because Quakers were pacifists. They were committed to refusing war, refusing weapons, but he dresses as a soldier. He takes an animal bladder and he fills it up with bright red juice, pokeberry juice. He ties off the top of the bladder, and then you've seen those books that have a secret compartment in them. He puts the bladder inside the book. He puts a sword at his waist, again, to look more like a soldier. And then he throws an overcoat over his military uniform so that no one can see the blade or the book. And he goes into the Quaker meeting, and he sits very near this very wealthy and powerful group of Quakers. And you may not know, Quakers do not have a central minister. People speak as the Spirit moves them. So Benjamin Lay waited his turn, and then he stood up, and in a thundering voice, he had a booming voice, even though he was actually very small. He had dwarfism. He was only about 4 feet tall. But in this booming voice, he says, God does not like us to oppress our fellow creatures. And by fellow creatures, he means Africans. So he throws off the coat, revealing the uniform, and there's this gasp among the people who see him. They're shocked that he would do this. So he takes the book and holds it above his head. He pulls out the sword and he says, slave owning is the greatest sin in the world. And then he runs the sword through the book, and the blood, the red berry juice, comes gushing down his arm. And then he runs among the wealthy Quakers and sprinkles the blood on their heads to illustrate that they are the ones, as slave owners, who are committing this terrible sin against God, against nature, and against their fellow Quakers. The room, which is full of hundreds of people, breaks out into complete pandemonium. I mean, it is just total chaos. And the whole time, Benjamin stands there as still as a statue with the blood dripping. He doesn't move. He just watches everything that's happened until a group of Quaker men come up and pick him up, and he doesn't resist. They then take him to the door and they throw him out into the street, hoping that they are done with him. But he wasn't done with them yet, because what he does is he goes then and lies down in front of the main door to the building where they're holding the meeting, so that when people leave the Quaker meeting, they're going to have to step over his body. And the idea was that he was going to put his body on the line to make it clear that the owning of slaves among Quakers was completely unacceptable, that this was wrong in every way. Now, you've got to remember, there was no movement against slavery at this time. In other words, it's going to be another 50 years before a movement begins to develop to challenge slavery. Now, the enslaved themselves had been resisting for a long time, but in terms of a formal abolitionist movement, that only really begins to happen in the 1780s. Benjamin is doing this in 1738. Now, he's already been, as I've said, an abolitionist for 20 years. He became an abolitionist in 1718, and he is one of the first people in world history to call for an immediate, total, and unconditional end to slavery worldwide. He says it's got to end, and it's got to end right now. Okay, so Benjamin Lay is an abolitionist. That's really the first thing you need to know about him. For 41 years of his life, he waged battle against this extremely powerful institution of human bondage. But he was much more than an abolitionist, and that actually is very important to my talk today, because Benjamin Lay had not just an opposition to slavery, he was devoted to equality in every sphere of human life. He believed in racial equality, obviously. He believed in gender equality. He believed that men and women were originally created equal and should always be equal. Benjamin Lay believed in class equality. He thought that wealth was deeply corrupting and that all the things that were wrong with slavery, with rich people buying slaves, they were destroying Quakerism, they were destroying civil society, and so class equality was crucial. He was also very committed to equality between human beings and animals. He was committed to the idea that the animal world, these were fellow creatures too, and that they must not be killed, they must not be eaten, they must not be exploited in any way. For example, Benjamin Lay always refused to ride a horse because he thought that was exploiting a horse. And then finally, Benjamin Lay was also very, very concerned with the environment, very far ahead of his time. He said, one of the things that he said was, beware of rich men who poison the earth for gain, for profit. Okay, so you've got these many kinds of equality. You've got a very integrated radical worldview. And the fundamental basis of the whole thing is that Benjamin Lay also had a critique of capitalism. Now, he didn't call it that because that word didn't really begin to be used until the 1880s. But his criticism was, we've got to prevent the market from dominating human life. So he had a critique of the market. He had a critique of the way in which the market distorted human values, the way in which the market was itself extremely violent. So this is very important to Benjamin Lay. He does pose an alternative in his own life to capitalism. It is based on revolutionary commoning. As I've said, I'm going to show you some slides in just a moment. But I want you to remember, Benjamin Lay is proposing these things almost 300 years ago. And this is really critical. So I want to, in this talk, answer two fundamental questions. The first question is, how did this working class man, and it is important to know that Benjamin Lay was a worker, he was a commoner, he was not an elite in any sense. How did he break through to this view of the world that put equality at its center and ended up making very radical demands in all spheres of life? How did he do that? What were the experiences he had that made that possible? So that's the first question. The second question is, if he is as important as I maintain that he is, why is he unknown? Why don't we know more about him? And so I want to try to address that question as well. So what we're going to get in a real sense in this talk is a kind of intellectual history from below. The exploration of the thinking of one ordinary working man to try to figure out how he came to have such a revolutionary view of the world that he lived in almost 300 years ago. Okay, so I want you to, here's an image of the book that I've written. Benjamin Lay, the fearless Benjamin Lay, the Quaker dwarf who became the first revolutionary abolitionist. Lukasz showed a copy of the same book. And here is Benjamin Lay himself. Now this painting, it's a very rare thing because Quakers did not like for their portraits to be painted because they thought that was an example of aristocratic self-indulgence. They hated the idea of wealthy people having themselves painted all the time. But Benjamin Franklin's wife, Deborah Franklin, actually had this painted on the sly with Benjamin Lay not knowing about it. She made this as a gift to her husband, Benjamin Franklin, the famous figure of the Enlightenment, who did consider Benjamin Lay to be one of his friends. So we'll come back to this image, but I do want to talk about Benjamin Lay's life, where he came from, how this life unfolded as a way of getting at some of the formative influences that will lead to this radicalism that I've mentioned. As I've said, he's born in 1682 in Essex, England, a little bit to the northeast of London. He's born into a Quaker family. They are a humble family. And his early experience of work is to be a shepherd. This was a very big textile region, this region called Essex. And so Benjamin's early life was spent as a shepherd to sheep, essentially grazing them and taking them around through the commons of Essex. This is going to prove to be very important in all kinds of ways. When Benjamin became 21 years old and was formally then free to do what he wanted, he left Essex and he went to London, where he became a sailor. He worked at sea for about a dozen years. I'm going to say more about how formative that was. He also met a woman named Sarah Smith. She was also a person who with dwarfism, and they also both had hunchbacks, I might mention. That's called kyphosis, or the over-curvature of the thoracic vertebrae. They got married in 1718. And at that point, Benjamin decided to leave the sea. And he and Sarah then sailed to Barbados in the Caribbean. This was an English colony and a site of sugar production that made this a really important part of the British Empire. Tremendous wealth was produced by sugar and slavery. Barbados is the first great English slave colony. He lives there for 2 years. He and Sarah open a little shop on the waterfront where they sell lots of everyday things to sailors, to artisans, but also to enslaved people who on Sundays, when they're free from their plantation work, would come into the city. And this was the period when Benjamin Lay was radicalized against slavery. So we'll come back to that point as well. Benjamin in 1720 returns to London, where he begins to fight with rich Quakers. He then moves back to Colchester in Essex, which is very near where he was born, where he continues to fight with rich Quakers who he thinks are ruining the Quaker faith. And then finally in 1732, Benjamin and Sarah emigrate to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. This was the Quaker colony, named for William Penn. So they go here in the hope of finding freedom and finding really the utopia that Quakers thought they could create in the New World. In 1734, he moved to a little village outside of Philadelphia called Abington, Pennsylvania. At this point, he moves into a cave. He and Sarah live in a cave. They grow their own food. They make their own clothes. This is a period of intense commoning and Benjamin's return to the land after a number of years doing other kinds of work. At this point, or soon after this, Benjamin publishes a book. It's got a very strange title, All Slave Keepers That Keep the Innocent in Bondage Apostates. By that he means any slave owner is not really a Christian, any slave owner is not really a Quaker, and he then proceeds to write almost 300 pages, one detailing the case to be made for the abolition of slavery, recounting also his own struggle against the rich Quakers. He includes some autobiography, and crucially for the historian, he writes a lot about the books he's reading. So this is really a valuable source in order to see how his mind is being formed by the things that he is coming into contact with. This book is published in 1738, right after he was kicked out of the Quaker meeting for what they called the bladder of blood. He was, at that point, excommunicated, or as the Quakers put it, disowned from the Quaker meeting. They declared that he was no longer able to take part in business meetings. So he was thrown out for his radical and subversive behavior. He continued his struggle against the Quaker slave owners for the rest of his life. He passed away in 1759 at age 77, really quite a long life for someone who had dwarfism, which frequently causes serious health problems. But then again, Benjamin was a vegetarian. He lived a very healthy life, and he lived to be 77. He did live long enough to see the Quakers take the first big step towards abolishing slavery. In 1758, the year before he died, a young Quaker abolitionist came running to his cave saying, Benjamin, Benjamin, the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting, that's the big group of Quakers that he had attacked. 21 years later, they have announced that no Quaker can participate in the slave trade. And if you do, you're going to be excommunicated from the Quaker faith. It would take another few years, really about 18 more years, before Quakers would decide that you could not own a slave and be a member of their religious group. But when they did that finally in 1776, the Quakers became the first group to outlaw slavery in their own midst. So Benjamin's work was ultimately successful. Okay, so I want to turn now to the sources of Benjamin Lay's radicalism, okay? And there are essentially four sources. I want to see these as like the strands of a rope. You see how the strands of a rope come together. Any one or even any two of them would not be sufficient to make the rope of Benjamin's radicalism, but together they can give us a sense of where all of his radical ideas came from. Okay, so Benjamin was a Quaker. This was, like I say, a radical Protestant offshoot, not only from the Catholic Church, but even from the formerly Protestant Church of England. And Quakers were what are called Antinomians. And this is kind of a complicated word. I want to spend a minute and explain it to you. Antinomians were basically people who rejected all civil and religious authority. And if you just break the word down, look at it here, anti as in opposed to, and nomos, the Greek, that means the law or authority or the social order. Antinomians were people who practiced antinomianism, who rejected the law and basically argued that you have within you the conscience that will allow you to make all of the decisions about right and wrong. You don't need a magistrate to tell you that. You don't need a minister to tell you that. You can decide that for yourself. Now, this is an extremely radical idea because it cuts at the root of all civil authority. Now, it's also an idea that comes out of the English Revolution. And just to pause for a minute on that, in the 1640s, a major struggle broke out in England between Parliament on the one hand and King Charles I and his supporters on the other hand, parliamentarians against royalists, as they're often called. You probably recall that King Charles was executed in 1649, and the radicals led by Oliver Cromwell then took power for 11 years. In this period, from 1649 onward to 1660, antinomianism flourishes like never before. These radical ideas bubble up from below in English society, and there are a series of groups, religious groups, who are associated with antinomianism. They are, first of all, the levelers, believed in leveling distinctions in society, the diggers, who were commoners who wanted to reclaim the commons. You have other groups called the ranters. The Quakers were among this antinomian group. The fact that Quakers did not have a formal minister was an expression of their antinomianism. And I should say that in the 1650s, several of these groups, these radical Protestant groups, made criticisms of slavery. Slavery to them was racial slavery, but it was also the slavery of indentured servitude, the slavery of wage labor, the slavery of the loss of the commons. So slavery was part of their critique, and that included political slavery, in which common men and women were denied their rights by the ruling class of England. Okay, now let's turn to Quakerism specifically. Quakerism had two sides. There was a radical side and a moderate side. The radical side was represented by a man named James Naylor. James Naylor was very much a predecessor of Benjamin Lay. He believed very much in ranting against corrupt ministers. He refused to take off his hat to anyone. Actually, Quakers as a group refused that sort of deference to gentlemen. Poor people were supposed to bow and scrape and take off their hats for gentlemen. They didn't take off their hats to anyone. Some of the more extreme Quakers refused to take off their hats when they were praying, meaning that God was just as equal to them as anybody else. So James Naylor also engaged in street theater like Benjamin Lay, but he took something a little too far in the sense that he staged the entry of Jesus into Jerusalem riding on a donkey. He did this in Bristol, England, in 1656. And after that, he was charged by Parliament with blasphemy. He was branded with a B on his forehead, which you can see here. His tongue was bored with a hot metal rod, and he was lashed from his neck to his hips. And basically, it was a set of punishments that more or less killed him. He remained alive for about a year, but he never recovered from this. So this is the most antinomian side of Quakerism. George Fox, who is the great symbol of moderate Quakerism, then undertook a counter-revolution within the Quaker faith to purge all of the more antinomian elements like James Naylor. There was another man named John Perot in the 1660s who was very active in Benjamin Lay's home county of Essex. So essentially, Fox won out, but Benjamin Lay represents the continuity of this more radical strand of Quakerism. And this is really the core of his revolutionary point of view. He combines the ideas of the levelers, the diggers, the ranters, the seekers within his variant of Quakerism, And you could argue that Benjamin Lay is really the last radical of the English Revolution. Okay, so Quakerism is the first strand of rope. Okay, the next strand is seafaring. Benjamin Lay, as I've said, went to sea, and right around the year 1700, 1702, 1703, he stayed at sea until 1713 or so, but he remained a sailor in his identity for the rest of his life. And I'll just give you an example of one of the joys of research. One of the things that Benjamin Lay was a reader. He was basically an autodidact, someone who had learned to read more or less on his own and was very proud of the fact that he could read. So in his cave, he kept a library of about 200 volumes, which is a very big library for that point in time, especially for a poor man. So I found out that one of Benjamin Lay's books was in an obscure archive outside of Philadelphia. And I went there in order to see it. And it turns out this was a set of sermons delivered by a very radical minister from the English Revolution. And Benjamin Lay had not only read these radical sermons, he annotated them. So you can see in his own writing what he thought about some of the ideas of the English Revolution. And so one of the things that I want to point out here, he's reading a man named William Dell, who was considered to be a seeker, one of those radical groups. And William Dell is writing that the problem of false prophets, people who pretend to speak the word of God but don't really speak the word of God, is a very serious problem for those committed to the most revolutionary form of religion. So William Dell says, I am a very weak vessel for conveying the message. I'm a bruised reed. That's the biblical language, meaning I'm not strong enough to tell the truth. And so Benjamin Lay writes, if so great a man as William Dell call himself a bruised reed, and then he adds, William Dell was the master of a college in the University of Cambridge, right? A very learned man. Then Benjamin Lay says, what may I call myself that was a poor common sailor and no more? In other words, he's asking himself, can I really take this vision of a world without slavery to the public, to all these rich Quakers? Am I a worthy carrier of that idea? He finally decided that he was. So his seafaring actually has a lot to do with it. And one of the main reasons why is that seafaring in the 18th century was based on a labor market that was genuinely international. And by that I mean on any given ship, you would have sailors from many different parts of the world. So sailors were extremely cosmopolitan. And Benjamin mentioned this in his book. He was very proud of the fact that he had this cosmopolitan experience. He said that he was committed to mankind in all nations, colors, and countries in the world. Now, it's also crucial that Benjamin began to learn about slavery when he was at sea. He had shipmates who had themselves been enslaved in Turkey. He had shipmates who had sailed in the African slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade. He heard sailors' yarns about how horrible slavery was, especially the Middle Passage, the voyage on the vessel from the west coast of Africa to the New World. So this is part of his education. Now, Benjamin made an innovation. So you must understand, sailors worked, as you can see, here's a ship in a storm. It was a very, very dangerous line of work. Sailors died routinely. You might fall from the rigging. You might be swept overboard in a storm. And consequently, because of the extreme dangers, there was a really high level of solidarity among sailors. So this was something that really meant a lot to Benjamin, the idea of solidarity. He made an innovation by saying that it doesn't just apply to your fellow sailors, it applies to all people who work under difficult circumstances. And this becomes the basis of his solidarity with people from Africa who were enslaved in the New World, in Barbados and in Pennsylvania, for example. I also want to emphasize that Benjamin's experience as a sailor equipped him to make certain arguments that others could not make. He would, for example, in his book, write to Quaker merchants involved in the slave trade, and he would say, "You are all murderers because people die in the slave trade and you don't care. You engage in the trade anyway, even though you know that thousands, in fact, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people have already died in this transatlantic slave trade." And you know what? He was exactly right. By the time he spoke these words, more than 100,000 people had already died in the Atlantic slave trade. So he knew exactly whereof he spoke. So maritime radicalism, this cosmopolitan point of view, this worldview that is based on solidarity, that's the second strand in the rope of Benjamin Lay's radicalism. Now, the third comes when he arrives in Bridgetown, Barbados in 1718. And this is the point where Benjamin Lay learns about and joins the struggles of people of African descent, the struggle against slavery. Well, he's working on the waterfront, right? He's got this little shop on the waterfront. Into his shop on Sundays when they have a day off of work, stagger, and I mean literally stagger into the shop, these poor, overworked, emaciated Africans. Some of them are so faint that they pass out. Some are being literally starved to death. Benjamin Lay sees this, he listens to their stories, and he's furious. He's furious at the slave owners who are oppressing these people. He's moved, his heart is engaged. He feels deep human sympathy for what they go through. But it's more than just the individuals he sees. He sees torture. He sees people being hanged. He sees people being literally ground up, their bodies ground up in the manufactories for sugar. You know, sugar production was like what they call a plantation in the field. There was a lot of machinery and people's body parts were mangled by all this. Benjamin saw this too. He saw ultimately that sugar was made with blood. This is a saying that abolitionists will come to use. Sugar is made with blood. He saw suicide, but he also saw resistance from the people, the enslaved people who were fighting back. Benjamin and Sarah began to invite these enslaved people to their home on Sundays for meals. They began to prepare very large numbers of meals for people who are hungry. At those meetings, Benjamin begins to denounce slavery as an institution. The rich sugar planters hear about this, they're furious, and they start talking about wanting to banish him and Sarah from the island because in their view, they are stirring up resistance. They might even be creating insurrection. Benjamin and Sarah at this point decide that they're going to leave anyway. They go back to London with great sorrow about the people they leave in such oppression behind, but they vow to work on this issue of slavery ever after in London. And then in 1732, as I've said, they go to Philadelphia where Benjamin encounters slavery once again. And he is furious to find slavery in the Quaker colony. This really makes him outraged. Okay, so that's the third strand of the rope. We've got radical Quakerism, we've got maritime radicalism, and now we have the experience of the struggle against slavery in Barbados. This is the point where Benjamin becomes an abolitionist, but he sees how people are exploited, how people are oppressed, and that is the third strand, which brings us then to the fourth, and most relevantly for this conference, this set of lectures, and that is commoning. Benjamin returns to the land. He lives in a cave. You can actually see in the background of this image, there is a stone facing that he has built at the edge of the cave with evergreen sprigs all around it. Inside there is his library. Inside there is where he and his Sarah will live. As I said earlier, they cultivate all of their own food, and they are both committed vegetarians. There's a symbolism of their vegetarianism here, where you can see in this basket there are apples and pears and squash. You can see here are melons. Benjamin believes that it is wrong to kill and eat animals. No animal exploitation. And here's the phrase he uses, which I find very revealing. He says, we must live on the innocent fruits of the earth. The innocent fruits of the earth. By that he meant fruits of the earth that are uncorrupted by the exploitation of working people. Things that were not produced by slaves. In fact, Benjamin Lay becomes the first person, as far as we know, in world history to boycott all goods that were produced by slave labor. So he refuses to eat sugar. He refuses to smoke tobacco. He refuses to drink tea because he knows there are plantation workers in India working in very bad conditions. He says we must stop all this. We must remember the workers who produce these things, and we must never consume them. Makes his own food. He makes his own clothes. As I've said, he's a vegetarian. Actually, he is a vegan about 200 years before that word is invented. So he has some very unusual views. He's a pantheist. He believes that the living God is in all living things. As I've said, he believes in animal rights, and he pioneers a kind of politics of consumption. You know, this idea that you are what you eat. It's the idea that is actually now being used to critique these workshops in which people in Vietnam and Indonesia and Pakistan make expensive Nike shoes while paying the workers a tiny percentage of their money. Benjamin Lay understood that idea in the 1730s. It's what Marx would call later commodity fetishism, how commodities hide the labor that is behind them. Benjamin Lay had that idea about 125 years before Marx did. And this is a centerpiece of his life. Now, in studying Benjamin as a commoner, I discovered that there's a really unusual influence, something I hadn't expected. Benjamin was a very avid reader of ancient philosophy. We know this because of some of the books that were in his library and some of the things that he wrote in his own book. And one of the key figures was someone from ancient Greece, a philosopher known as Diogenes, who was actually known as one of the most radical philosophers of antiquity. One of the things that Diogenes believed was that people must always speak truth to power. In other words, you must always call out the wealthiest people, the most powerful people. You must speak the truth to them more than anyone else. This in the Greek is called parrhesia. So Benjamin Lay, you can see here's Diogenes with his walking stick. Here's Benjamin Lay with his walking stick. They were both vegetarians. They both had this very radical view that you have to act out your ideas in public. This is one of the things that Diogenes did. Benjamin Lay did the same thing with, for example, the bladder of blood incident. So what we find is that in addition to Quakerism, there is a secular, or you might even call it a pagan source of radicalism. And this is actually our fourth and final strand, you've got Quaker radicalism, maritime radicalism, the struggles of African peoples, and finally, radical philosophy from ancient Greece as linked to commoning that forms the fourth and final strand of Benjamin Lay's radical worldview. So those, I think, are really the keys. Now, let me offer a few points in conclusion. One thing I'll mention is that since this book was completed, I'm very happy to report that 4 Quaker meetings that disowned Benjamin Lay in the 18th century have now taken him back. And Benjamin Lay is beginning to make a comeback. He is becoming better known. A group was formed in Philadelphia called the Benjamin Lay Society. And as you may or may not know, City Hall in Philadelphia, on top of it has a statue of William Penn, the founder of Pennsylvania. He was a rich Quaker and he was a slave owner. So the Benjamin Lay Society is now demanding that a new statue of Benjamin Lay be put on top of Philadelphia City Hall. And their idea is that Benjamin Lay was woke, as they put it, in 1738. But let's go back, if I may, to the questions that I posed at the outset. How did he do it? Well, I've answered that question by posing or explaining these 4 different strands of radicalism which came together. And this is really crucial. What all this added up to was a commoner's view of the world, a very radical commoner's view. It also meant that Benjamin Lay was engaged in something that Peter Linebaugh and I have called enlightenment from below. Enlightenment has always been considered to be a middle and upper class project, but we find that lots of ordinary working people arrived at enlightened ideas through a different set of experiences, frequently through their working experiences, as was the case with Benjamin Lay. So if Benjamin Lay had this extraordinary body of ideas, why has it taken so long for us to remember him? Why is he so unknown? This is a tough question. I think the first place we must go in answering this question is to say that the Quakers themselves are partly responsible for this because they disowned Benjamin Lay. They tried to silence him. They tried to marginalize him. Quakers still owned a lot of slaves at that time. And in fact, they didn't want Benjamin Lay constantly bringing up this issue of emancipating their slaves. So they played a role in silencing his voice. Historians then come along, and their narrative of the rise of the movement of abolitionism doesn't have any room for Benjamin Lay because, first of all, he's from the wrong class. As I've said, the Enlightenment project is a bourgeois project. It doesn't include people like this commoner Benjamin Lay. He's from the wrong class. He's got the wrong kind of body. His body is a big part of how people responded to him. He is also someone who was considered to be using the wrong methods of agitation. He was militant. He was angry. He was furious. He used very radical techniques of agitation. Benjamin Lay was an agitator. This did not fit well with the respectable view of anti-slavery, which will emerge considerably later. So my final point really is this. I wanted to bring Benjamin Lay back to public consciousness and to historical memory because we need him. It's not that he needs us, we need him. We need to have him on our side. We need to know that there were very deeply principled people who posed serious, realistic alternatives to the development of capitalism going back to the 17th and the 18th century. He was doing these kinds of things. He had this very powerful radical and fully integrated worldview. He believed that, in fact, a better world was possible. And lo and behold, Benjamin Lay sounds in the end very modern. I suspect a lot of people think that a gender conscious, race conscious, class conscious, environmentally conscious person was not even possible until the 1970s. And yet here we have precisely this example almost 300 years ago. So my plea to you is to study the lives of people like Benjamin Lay. Let us learn from it. Let us be inspired by it. Let us use his fertile imagination to feed our own as we try to find a better way forward in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcus, for this insightful and very inspiring introduction to biography of Benjamin Lay, to his intellectual biography, intellectual roots, but also to the practical side of his life. I think that these both sides of your lecture, the conceptual one and also this the more political one, are crucial for the issues that we post in our seminars. Before we start the discussion, I would like to remind our participants that you can take part in our meeting at Zoom, and you can pose your questions at Zoom by putting your camera on and putting your microphone on, or you can take part in our meeting at Facebook, and you can post your questions there at our Facebook profile by writing the question. And please also remember that if you decide to participate in our discussion with your screen or with your voice, we will interpret it as the form of consent for the use of your presence in further publication of the material. The lecture will be published next week with Polish subtitles, so you can also share and circulate our meeting with non-English speaking comrades and friends. I have prepared a couple of questions to Professor Rediker. Some of them will refer to today's lecture, and some of them will refer more to his works, to his other books. And of course, if you have your own questions right now, then please let us know. You can write on chat. Okay, we have already two people, so maybe we will start with two questions from the audience, and then I will pose my question. So Łukasz Zaremba will be the first person who would like to take part in our discussion.
Hi, hello. My name is Łukasz. Thank you for a wonderful lecture. I have two questions, and both of them seem marginal to me, but seem marginal to the main focus of your lecture. But maybe that's a good start to ask about a few more details about the lecture and about the book, the book itself. The first question would be, among many occupations, among many jobs that Benjamin Lay takes upon, performs during his life, every occupation in your book seems to make sense in his biography, and at the same time, he makes sense of it, like he uses it especially for thinking, if I understand correctly. So you told us about the experience of being a sailor and the fact that he sort of taken upon the sailor identity and identified with a sailor even years after being one. You in your book you spend a lot of time, if I remember correctly, writing about him being a shepherd, and then using it for metaphors in his writing. You mention him as a bookseller, and you go through the books that he traveled to America with to sell them and to educate. And at the same time, he's a self-taught philosopher, so everything makes sense here. But you also mentioned in your book a few times the fact that he was also a glove maker and that he hated the job. So what can you do with glove making with a guy that at the end becomes vegan or vegetarian, refuses to take part in money economy, etc., etc. So that would be the first question. And if I may ask the second one,
Lucas, can I answer that one first?
Of course.
I love the idea of I like your formulation that he used his work experience to think, that he thought through the work experience, because every work experience does permit that. You can see the world through that work experience. Yeah, I'd say that the glove maker, the fact that he made gloves and made gloves from the skins of dead animals is a direct contribution to the fact that he becomes someone who's committed to animal rights and is committed to vegetarianism. So he loved sheep, he loved seafaring, he loved books, he hated making gloves, but they all ended up having significant impact on the way he saw the world. It's just in the case of gloves, it's quite dialectical.
Thank you. And the other question would be a question about the picture that is on the cover of your book, the painting. You spend a lot of time in your book, and you mentioned it today, writing about the fate of the picture, that being copied, repainted, etc., sort of repeats the travels of Benjamin Lay himself. So goes into the Atlantic Triangle and is found as a reprint somewhere very far away from where Benjamin Lay died. The picture itself is in a way against his will or without his permission. So the question, and then rediscovery of the picture in the 20th century. So in a way you provoke this question with the situation of putting a monument of Benjamin Lay taken from the picture and putting it in contemporary Philadelphia. The idea of doing that instead of the monuments of all the slave owners that are being finally victims of iconoclastic attacks today. So the question would be, do you have a program of visual imagery that you use? Because it seems to me that in almost every of your book, you spend a very focused attention, at least in one part of the book, on a picture that you're trying to bring back or reinterpret. Is it a picture of a woman pirate that then maybe becomes a revolutionary Marianne in Delacroix, or is it a picture of a slave ship, etc., etc.? I could go through some of your books and mention different pictures, but is there a program that you want to propose for today in times where a certain set of historic pictures is finally being demolished, is a victim of iconoclastic attacks, etc., etc.?
Yeah, these are very well-informed questions, Lukasz. I can see that, in fact, if I get a tough question about Benjamin Lay, I might just let you answer it instead of me. But You're right. I love the social history of art. So you're absolutely right. In all of my books, there is a very strong attention to what I think of as visual evidence, that we can get closer to history from below by looking at these images in their context. Now, I'll tell you something that I've had the great good fortune to work with some really outstanding editors in publishing my books. And one of them, named Wendy Wolf from Viking Penguin, told me that every book's illustrations should recount the fundamental argument of the book. In other words, you should be able to go to a book, look at its images only, and pretty much understand what the book is trying to say. So that is actually something I try to do. I try to embody the argument of the book in the images that accompany the text. Okay, so that's my personal approach. The larger question you're asking, which is basically about how popular struggles from below get attached to and embedded in images, including sculpture. I think this is a really critical question. And the more we can recover that lost history. I mean, for example, that famous image of Benjamin Lay that I showed has no reference to slavery in it. That's because I think that people were still made very nervous about the fact that Benjamin was so radically opposed to slavery. They de-radicalized that painting, and they de-radicalized the engravings that were made based on that painting. But when representations of this kind, historical representations, whether in image or in sculpture, gets sufficiently politicized that people want to know why were all of these Southern generals memorialized in the late 19th and early 20th century? Well, now we know it's because of the doctrine of the lost cause, in which the South was basically returning to its place in political life. And every one of these statues was meant to be a weapon in that battle, an assertion of power. So art in general is never neutral. It's always got this political and ideological dimension. And I think Benjamin Lay is a very good example of the way in which we could actually memorialize someone who represents the highest values of democracy and equality. I think I've just literally learned last week that a group of people in Philadelphia have proposed creating a sculpture of Benjamin Lay for the city of Philadelphia. I don't think they're going to put it on top of City Hall, but I think there is a chance that this will happen. And I think that, there's a struggle between the statues too. And that's something that we really need. I see the whole controversy about Confederate Civil War generals as a massive opportunity for education. That we can learn about how these and why these statues were built in the first place. What do they mean? And asking those questions is one way of coming to grips with white supremacy and the history of racism in the United States. And I think similar things would be true in other countries.
Thank you so much, and sorry for taking that much time.
Thank you for very interesting exchange between Marcus and Łukasz. And we have one more question right now from the audience, please.
Hello. Thank you for the lecture. It was very interesting, and Benjamin Lay is a fascinating figure. But what I wanted to ask you concerns the way you narrativize this Benjamin Lay within a historical context as a certain prefiguration of modernity or modern forms of social critique, militancy, and so on, so on. So my question is, like, I can see why it is so tempting to say that Benjamin Lay is certain prefiguration of later forms of critique addressed towards global capitalism, animal cruelty, and so on, so on. But I wanted to ask you, is it really necessary to build this kind of historical narrative? And what kind of, and do you think if there are any alternative ways in which we can think about this kind of heterodoxal, heretical, or radical figures within history without like putting them on this temporal axis, which leads from like the genealogy of modernity to its current representations. I mean, like when you speak of Diogenes, for example, as an inspiration of Benjamin Lay, there is no this kind of, you do not use this kind of prefiguration, because Diogenes is a radical figure on his own rights within his own historical context. And I was wondering whether it wouldn't be a better idea to try to map a certain, I don't know how to put it, but not temporally organized mapping of those radical references, which in which Benjamin Lay has his own like autonomous part, not only as some kind of prefiguration of later currents, right? This is my my question.
Okay, thank you. I guess I would say that I don't really see Lay as a precursor of modernity, but I do see him as part of an alternative tradition in the critique, not just of modernity, but specifically of capitalism. So is it possible to do this a different way? Certainly. But one of the things I've tried to do in the book is to talk about how Benjamin Lay was really not like a modern secular radical at all. In a great many respects, he was profoundly religious. And this was something that I really had to struggle to comprehend. Now, things like liberation theology in Latin America really help, because Benjamin Lay is very much in this kind of radical Christian tradition. There were people like him before, and there have been many people like him afterwards. So I think it is possible to write about him and stress his singularity. And I think he was quite a singular person in many respects. But my feeling is that he's been so marginalized and isolated that we need to bring him back into discussion. We need to see what his ideas can contribute to the situation we're in today. I think I don't agree with Michel Foucault very often, but I do believe that he's right when he said every history is a genealogy of the present. And that in that way, Benjamin Lay, the history of Benjamin Lay is like the history of everybody else. They're made to have a concrete relationship to the relations of power that exist in the moment in which the book is written. Diogenes was certainly a radical in his time. He would be a radical in our time. And to tell you the truth, I don't think we've caught up with Benjamin Lay yet. We may, congratulate ourselves on being modern and radical, but I think we haven't caught up with him yet in terms of the depth of his commitments to an alternative world. So yes, I think Benjamin Lay could fit into many different ways of doing history, but my view is that we need him, and to make him relevant to the present is an important part of the narrative strategy.
Okay, so maybe now I will let myself to post 2 questions, and then I see there is another one from Facebook. So my first question would be about overlapping of intellectual and practical biography, but we spent a lot of time discussing this overlapping in biography of Benjamin Lay. And I am also very curious about your own biography as an academic, theorist, and activist, Marcus. How come that you started to conduct the research on the revolutionary Atlantic? Because it's a fascinating question how historians can go beyond national historiography and launch the research on trans-cultural and maritime history. What pushed you into that direction, to the ocean, to the sea? Political developments in United States, or some intellectual developments, intellectual trends?
Well, I mean, the first point to be made, Lukasz, is that I am a creature of the social movements of the 1960s and 1970s. That formed me politically, and by that I mean the civil rights movement, the movement against the war in Vietnam, the student movement, the Black Power movement, the women's movement, all of these movements, which I grouped together under the rubric New Left. That's why I wanted to become a historian, because people who were involved in those movements were demanding a new kind of history, and it was a history from below. So my first impulses to do history were political, not intellectual. When I finally decided to pursue my studies, I went with a commitment to history from below, but I didn't know what form that would take. In fact, when I first went away for graduate study, my plan was to become a historian of slavery. And I was very interested, especially in slavery in the West Indies, in the Caribbean. But when I began to do research, I started to work on sailors. So one honest answer to your question is that I became an Atlantic historian by accident, since I chose Atlantic workers, and then just by following them wherever they went, I automatically became an Atlantic historian. So that is true. A lot of my work has been the playing out of the implications of that original choice to study sailors and pirates and seafaring people. But at the same time, for political reasons, I was very interested in the idea of proletarian internationalism, and maybe in developing a new idea about what that means. In other words, that to study working people as they cooperate with each other beyond the boundaries of the nation state, rather than studying them in nationally organized blocks of either vanguard parties or trade unions, seems to me to be a different sort of approach, and a much more from below approach. So I guess you could say that my movement towards Atlantic history was a combination of politics, choice, and luck.
Yes, so we clearly can see the unity of theory and practice also in your biography, and it is in some kind similar to Benjamin Lay case. And my second question would be, maybe it will be a failed question, maybe it will be a stupid question. It is built just on some assumptions. Because I always wondered when I read your books, if it is possible to connect the research on the many-headed hydra from Atlantic, so Atlantic proletariat, with the Baltic Sea and with Central Eastern Europe. Because we know from the history of maritime economy, like in famous books by Fernand Braudel, that for the history of European capitalism and for the European expansion to the New World, it was crucial to connect the Baltic, the Atlantic, and the Mediterranean Sea, right? These three basins. And we also know here in Poland that these trade relations on Baltic Sea were very important for the history of our country as well. And the second reason why I pose this question are some events, some cases of circulation of ideas, people, and struggles from Baltic, from Poland to the Caribbean and New World. And here, for example, the famous expedition of Polish soldiers, Napoleonic expeditions to San Domingo, in which part of Polish soldiers changed their sides and started to support the Black revolutionaries, is one obvious example. And the second obvious and famous example for us in Poland is the figure of Tadeusz Kościuszko, so important participant of struggle for American independence and also Polish national liberator. At the same time, Kościuszko was fond of freedom for Native Americans. He had Black associate in American army. He had contacts with Indian chiefs, and he also bequeathed his property in a last will for freeing the private slaves of Thomas Jefferson. So these two quite famous examples from Poland are for me, very similar to the issues that you pose in your books, and I wonder if there are more such cases and examples, and if there's the Baltic head of the Atlantic many-headed hydra.
The answer is yes, yes, and yes. It's possible. I'm sure that if Baltic history is approached from the point of view of the workers who make that system run, that you will find a great many connections and different kinds of radicalism being expressed. I think the answer is definitely yes. And then finally, Kościuszko is definitely a Hydra head. There is absolutely no question about it. He is of that ilk of revolutionaries. And of course, he didn't emerge from nowhere, right? He had a set of formative experiences. You're going to find related experiences among other people. You're going to find those things in Poland. I think, it's very exciting, this idea of studying the many-headed hydra in the Baltic. I really encourage you and all your colleagues who have the language skills to do that, to do that kind of work. I think it's really critical. And what you'll find is that knowledge, ideas, information is circulating among Polish sailors and Polish soldiers in the same way that it's doing so in the Atlantic. So I would be very enthusiastic about this project, and maybe even a multinational project of scholars to study archives in different parts of the Baltic, to see what kinds of connections can be found, and to see, how that region is linked to the age of revolution. I think it's a tremendously exciting possibility. So, have I found other examples? I've seen references to Polish soldiers, but in general, you're going to find these things when you're really looking for them. And I think when you have the right language skills in order to evaluate what you find. So there's an old saying in the Bible, which I am a strong believer in. It says, "Seek and ye shall find." And I do believe that will be the history of the Baltic and the Polish hydro.
Yes, so your methodology is like follow the actor, follow the sailors, follow the workers, and then probably we will find something. Yeah, the research project for Baltic would be demanding because there are many languages all around the Baltic Sea, and it should be, I think, a very international project to do it. Okay, we have one more question from Facebook. I will read it out loud. The question by Agnieszka Strzemińska. Thank you. This was indeed inspiring. On the note of finding inspiring biographies, I was wondering what was the level to which he was airbrushed from history, Benjamin Lay, and apart from being woke in 1738, what is the story of bringing him back?
Okay. Yes, thank you, Agnieszka. Benjamin Lay was never completely forgotten in history, but he was, as I've said, marginalized. And I'll just give you one example of that. Probably the most famous historian of abolition, the late Professor David Bryan Davis, who wrote numerous books on the Atlantic and anti-slavery ideas. He called Benjamin Lay, and I'm quoting here, a demented little hunchback, end quote. And that's a pretty violent and dismissive phrase. Demented, meaning that he was insane and therefore his ideas were not to be taken seriously. Little because he was a dwarf. And of course he had kyphosis and he had a hunched back. But that's the level of arrogance that you sometimes would find in the way people would deal with Benjamin Lay. And that's the way a lot of people dealt with him in his own lifetime. He writes in his book that when he would give his speeches about slavery in a meeting, people would laugh, they would condescend, they would mock him, you know, but the truth is that never deterred him, that never slowed him down, that never took him away from fighting for the things that he believed in. So I think Benjamin Lay is not completely forgotten, but if you were to ask, even in the United States, how many people have heard of him, the number is very, very small. He's not been taught in the history books, either at the primary or secondary or college level. So he until very recently, he was unknown. Now, I wrote this book to try to make him known, and I'm glad to say we've had some real success. And Benjamin Lay is much better known now than he's ever been. We have now historical markers put up to him. The Quakers have put a gravestone in their cemetery where he is buried. As I've said, the Quaker meetings have taken him back. There's been quite a lot of writing about him. And, you know, and for my own purposes, I've got a whole series of Benjamin Lay projects, which are all designed to increase his public visibility. So I wrote this scholarly book, The Fearless Benjamin Lay. I've given a lot of lectures. I've co-written a song. I've co-written a play. I've worked with an artist to produce a graphic novel. And there's going to be a children's book coming out on Benjamin Lay. So I'm basically trying to cover the waterfront and deal with every sort of genre I can about Benjamin Lay. I'm especially thrilled about the play that I've written with a dear friend of mine, a very distinguished playwright named Naomi Wallace. And we basically have brought Benjamin back from the dead to speak to a Quaker meeting and explain to them why they need to let him back into the meeting, because he was right about slavery and they were wrong. And that's actually what the contemporary Quaker meetings have already admitted. And if you can go online and look up some of their statements about Benjamin Lay, they say, for example, that Benjamin Lay told the truth that some Quakers could not bear to hear. And we reaffirm his radical spirit in our time, which is to say, he was right, our Quaker ancestors were wrong. So he's been readmitted in a very real way to the Quaker faith. So anyway, the story of bringing him back is going to be a complicated one. It's going to have to involve a lot of people. Hopefully the book will be translated, and it's already being translated in several places. But it's going to take people making demands which essentially say, this man matters. We reach back to the past to make him part of our present. That's what it's going to take for him to become better known. And I think we've made some progress.
Thank you for the answer. Do we have more questions from the audience? Okay, if not, then maybe I will pose the last one. You've dedicated your book on Benjamin Lay to your children with the hope that their generation will take inspiration from his life story. It is written on the cover, on the title page of the book. Do you see in contemporary world any manifestations of the living legacy of Benjamin Lay, like in social movements, any practices that may resemble this revolutionary commoning? Because the example of his life is rather a small scale one, rather family unit. And of course it is a great example, but still it cannot change the whole world. It's not, the big thing. And I wonder, do you see any connections between this legacy of his life and contemporary movements?
Well, it's a little bit like what Zhou Enlai said in the middle of the 20th century about the significance of the French Revolution. He said, it's too early to tell. And I think that's true of Benjamin Lay. It's too early to tell what kind of influence he may have. But I think that one of the most important things about radical ideas is that they are invented and reinvented. They die out, they come back. There is this kind of underground or below decks life of radical ideas. This is one of the big themes of the many-headed hydra, as you know. This notion that there are radical ideas that appear in the English Revolution and then they appear in the age of revolution in the late 18th century. There's a continuity there. Benjamin Lay is one of those continuities. He's one of the connectors of the revolutions of the mid 17th century to the revolutions of the late 18th century. So I think, so basically, let's take the example of the international movement against sweatshops, in which people say, when you lace up your expensive running shoes, think of the workers who produced those shoes. Think of the conditions in which they produced those shoes. Did those people, the organizers of that movement, know about Benjamin Lay? No, I don't think they did. But they probably did know something about the politics of consumption, the radical critique of consumption. And Benjamin Lay really was the person who invented that, even though his name is no longer attached to it. So even though he himself died and was in many ways forgotten, the ideas do have a life of their own. They enter into other movements and they are revived and they're given life. So I think that there are a lot of ideas that Benjamin Lay had that, I mean, the very idea that slavery had to be abolished immediately, right? This was much debated. I mean, there was a whole argument about gradualism versus immediatism. People thought for a long time that the great abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison invented the idea of immediate abolition. He did not. And there were people in the anti-slavery movement who knew that Benjamin Lay was the origin of that idea. So again, it's a very complicated business to attribute authorship to an idea. But in truth, I don't think Benjamin Lay would have cared whether he was given credit for an idea. He would just care if the idea was itself embodied in action. And that's what I think matters most of all. And there is a wide array of radical ideas out there whose histories we don't know. And this, of course, is one of the main reasons why we need to study the past, because it, as I've said, it enriches our notions of the future. So I think we live with Benjamin Lay, even though we can't always name him. His ideas have lived on, and in many ways he won. He continues to win. He hasn't won on the environment yet, but I have a friend who likes to take Benjamin's comment, beware rich men who poison the earth for gain. And then he writes Benjamin Lay, 1738, and he takes this sign to these environmental protests. And he says that he gets more comments on that sign than any sign he's ever made. And people come up to him and say, somebody said this in 1738? Really? Is that possible? And so he tells them the story of Benjamin Lay. So again, if he's going to live again, it's because we decide that he's valuable to us. And we tell his story and tell the story of some of the ideas that he stood for. That's the hope.
Yeah, I think it's the living, Katarzyna, yeah, I know that you want to pose a question. I wanted to thank Marcus for his last answer, because I also think that it is about the living experience of being a commoner in the age of globalization, and maybe it was a pioneering experience of Benjamin as a sailor, as cosmopolitan subject, with all these encounters and networks and experiences that he had in Atlantic Triangle in 3 continents. And yes, I would like to give opportunity to Katarzyna to
thank you.
As well.
And okay, and Marcus, thank you for the book, because I read it with a great interest, and I found it really inspiring. And I've got 2 questions, and the first one concerns the Benjamin Lay's book, because you mentioned only once in your lecture, and you write about it a little bit more in your book. And the question concerns the elements of oral culture that are present in this book, because that's what you say in the book. And it seems quite important, because it was the oral culture that in Quakers was much more radical than the print culture. I mean, in Benjamin Lay's times, because in the print, many of the ideas were censored, and actually almost all anti-slavery discussion was kept out of print. So could you please tell us a bit more about this oral dimension of Benjamin Lay's book? And the second, and it's not the second question, because it's the second part of the first question, and it's quite correlated with the first part, is this fact that Benjamin Lay's book preserved some parts of the oral culture, made it more accessible to the world, to the plebeian world. I mean, what I want to ask is, because you don't write it in your book, I mean, the reception of Benjamin Lay's book, I mean, who read it? Did other sailors, shepherds, glove makers read Benjamin Lay?
You know, I love this question, because a big influence in my life was my grandfather, who was a coal miner and who was a master storyteller. He told me, and this is a tradition in the Appalachian part of the United States, a very poor part of the United States, and my family was from Kentucky. But he would tell these amazing stories. And then I found one day this great essay by Walter Benjamin called The Storyteller. And he says there are basically 2 kinds of storytellers. There are the peasant storytellers, as he calls them, who tell the stories that are rich in local lore and understanding. And then there is the sailor storyteller, who tells stories that come from far away. So my grandfather was kind of the peasant/miner storyteller, and all the people I've studied were the sailor storytellers, and the sailors had a very specific kind of tradition of storytelling. It's called the sailor's yarn, where they're sitting on the deck and the wind is in the sails and there's nothing to do, and so somebody spins a yarn, as they call it. They're actually creating yarn as they do it. They're unraveling rope to create something to put into the seams of the planks to keep the ship watertight. So spinning a yarn is actually linked to a labor process, like all these other sorts of things that the other Lukáš mentioned about work and thinking. So Benjamin Lay was a sailor. He was socialized as a sailor. So in his book, as you know, are sailors' yarns. Okay, so that's the first point. They are embedded. He is a natural storyteller in the oral tradition who just happened to write down some of the stories. Okay, so that's the first point. The second point is that the way Benjamin Lay was known, the way, there's a very famous figure named Benjamin Rush, who was an anti-slavery Enlightenment figure. He was a physician. He signed the Declaration of Independence. He was from Philadelphia. He was the first person to write a biography of Benjamin Lay. It was a fairly short thing, but he said in his own day, in Benjamin Lay's own day, Lay was the most famous person in the entire colony of Pennsylvania. And it wasn't because everybody had read his book. It was because everybody had heard stories about him. And the fact that he performed this, well, I call it in the book, as you know, guerrilla theater. It's like guerrilla war as people act out stories and ideas. Benjamin Lay was performing guerrilla theater at that big Quaker meeting where he ran the sword through the book and the blood dripped down, that kind of guerrilla theater. Can you imagine how many hundreds, if not thousands of times that story was told after people left that building? Like they go back, what happened at the big Quaker meeting? You wouldn't believe what this guy Benjamin Lay did, right? Everybody talks about that. So Benjamin Lay's methods of protest were geared to generate the oral stories, to empower the oral culture that would, in fact, in his view, he didn't care very much that he became famous. He wanted his ideas to become famous. He wanted people to hear about this total opposition to slavery. So it's a very sophisticated comment on your part to ask about the oral tradition, both in the book, but then also alongside the book, because this is the primary conveyor of the ideas. And the same was actually true in Diogenes' day. It's the stories that people tell about the philosophical events that you organize. So I think that Benjamin's relationship to these, and he had very little schooling. So he was definitely completely a product of the oral culture. When did he learn to read and write? He said he went to school for a short time, but my guess is that he was taught to read and write by his fellow sailors, because that's what sailors did. The literate sailors would teach the illiterate sailors how to read and write. And this is actually something that Naomi Wallace and I treat as a significant part of the play, Benjamin Lay learning to read and write. So I guess my last point is that, yeah, this is part of the art of history from below, of looking for the hidden means of communication within the things that we regard as texts, because they're not all reducible to that. They have geometric social meanings that flow far outside the pages of that book. And stories, I think, are really the crucial thing for Benjamin Lay. And he understood this perfectly well. He understood that if he could get people talking about himself and his ideas, that was a way to spread the anti-slavery message.
But do we know anything about the reception of his book? I mean, who read it? And I don't know who bought it. What were the reactions just to the text? That was perhaps we don't know anything. I don't know.
We know very little.
Okay.
We know very little. We know that some of the British abolitionists, like Thomas Clarkson, read it. I found a couple of reviews, a couple of comments, and let me tell you why it might not have been widely read. It's a really hard book to read.
Okay.
And partly that's because Benjamin was not your usual writer. And he apologizes for this. He said, look, he says, this book is written by an uneducated person. I'm just a poor common sailor. Right? Now, he says that in the book. You know, he says, please have patience with me. So the book has this kind of stream of consciousness, where one minute he's talking about a verse in the Bible opposed to slavery, and the next minute he's talking about a story a sailor told him, and the next minute he's talking about the book he's reading right now. So I had to read this book. I think I read the book 7 times just to even understand it. It's structurally, it's weird. Thematically, it's weird. It's not your normal book. So this would have limited its readership. But the stories were fairly simple and straightforward. And so, and a lot of the stories are in the book. In other words, the things that are in the book that he produces are things that he acted out. So you can actually imagine this sort of feedback. And then there's another wonderful source, which you may remember from the book. A Quaker, a later Quaker, some 60 years after Benjamin died, a man named Robert Vaux went around and interviewed old Quakers about some of the things Benjamin Lay did. And they gathered those stories up and he published them in a new biography of Benjamin Lay. So there's a little bit of an oral history to that book, which is kind of nice. So we get a sense of what people remembered, because they were young when Benjamin Lay was doing these things. We were all people who were in their 80s around 1810. So they remembered Benjamin Lay and told their stories of him. So again, inside the printed text is an oral set of sources.
Mm-hmm. Łukasz, may I ask another question, or are there some?
Michał would like to pose one question too, but if you really want to...
No, I can do that after Michał, okay.
Okay, so this will be, I think, the last question for today, and it will come from Michał Pospiszil, our third curator. Please, Michał.
Thank you for your fascinating lecture, Marcus. I would like to ask you a short question about the philosophy from below. And how do you think would this sort of philosophy differ from the philosophy exercised by the elites? You know, we obviously have some philosophers from below. We know the book written by Carlo Ginzburg about Manocchio and this famous book, Cheese and Words. We know that we can probably read Winston Lay books, Winston Lay intellectual production as a kind of philosophy from below. But what do you think would be the main difference between this kind of intellectual approach?
Well, let me first say that you've just outlined a really outstanding idea for a book that you yourself should write. To bring Manocchio, Benjamin Lay, and Winstanley into the same conversation of philosophy from below would be excellent. I strongly encourage you to pursue that idea. What would we find? I think what we would find is that, and essentially in all 3 of those cases, we're talking about the history of heresy. These are people who developed radical ideas outside of the hegemonic discourse of their day. And Carlo Ginzburg's exploration of Manocchio's thought is really brilliant in this way. He's a miller, right? So people come and go to the mill all the time. It's a little bit like being a sailor. Your position in the division of labor determines the people you talk to and how the information flows. Winstanley would have a slightly different take. He was a failed merchant. Actually, his partner went on to be quite involved in the slave trade. But the bitterness caused by his failure is one of the things that propelled him towards more radical ideas. And of course, he got involved with the diggers who wanted to take concrete action. So I think probably the biggest difference that you would find between philosophy from above and philosophy from below is that philosophy from below would be much more keyed to action, the things that you do, to not abstracting the idea out of its social relations, but very much putting it within. And this goes back to the question of work, Minocchio's work, Benjamin Lay's work. These things really matter. And so there's a kind of, I'd say, deep materialism to philosophy from below. It really is of the world. It emerges from the world. It's concrete in ways that I think other philosophical approaches might be abstract. But then again, it's also true that the more abstract philosophies are sometimes born of dialogues with the concrete philosophies from below. There's very interesting work now to show that John Locke was in very deep conversation with the levelers and some of the other philosophers from below in the English Revolution. So they have a formative influence in that way as well, of influencing other kinds of thought. I often wonder about the influence of the sailor's yarn on philosophy. You know, you remember Sir Thomas More's Utopia begins with a man named Raphael Hythloday, who has just come home from a voyage and has found this society where people live without private property. This then becomes a philosophical idea of what does it mean to live without private property. That idea was very much influenced by the discovery of indigenous peoples in the Americas who did live without private property, who did live without class and hierarchy in the same way. The great French humanist philosopher Montaigne was told stories by a servant of his who had been a sailor who had gone to Brazil and had met these indigenous people. This is one of the big causes, one of the deep influences on one of Montaigne's most famous essays called Of Cannibalism, in which he concludes it's not the indigenous people who are the cannibals, it's the European imperialists who are the cannibals. So I think this idea of how different kinds of philosophy are linked and blend and influence each other is a really fertile area for exploration.
Thank you. I think it's a great definition of commoning for the conclusion of our meeting. Commoning as a practice of working and thinking and working with other people, also from other cultural backgrounds, as a source, as an engine for radical ideas and putting these ideas into work. So the abolition of this division of intellectual and manual labor, it is, I think, something which is absolutely fundamental for any emancipative project and also for our cycle of seminars. So thank you. Yes.
I would like to recommend to everybody Peter Linebaugh's latest book. It's got an unusual title. It's called Red Round Globe Hot Burning. It's a phrase from the poet William Blake. Okay, here it comes. Okay, hold it up so everybody can see it. Okay.
This is the cover.
Okay, so this book explores in a very deep way the different kinds of commons that existed around the Atlantic, in Ireland, in England, in West Africa, in the Caribbean, in North America, and how all of those are linked to the rise of capitalism and industrialization, and in the end, with the destruction of the world as an ecosystem. So I really do strongly recommend that book for, in my view, the best and most powerful thinking on the history of the commons that I have ever read. I do recommend it strongly, and I'm sure you may feel the same way, Lukáš.
Yeah, it is written as a kind of love story between two people, one people from England and second from Caribbean, multiracial marriage, we can say. So it is great, even as an entertainment, to read this book. It is not a boring history, and of course with your books is the same, but I think that here the form of this book is by Peter Leinvall is exceptional. And so I also truly recommend it to all our participants. So thank you, Marcus, once again, and thank you for all of you who want to join us and take part in the discussion. I think it was a very strong opening for the cycle of our seminars, Plebs, the Commons, and Alternatives to Capitalism. In the next month, we will have the lecture by Silvia Federici, and of course, I don't have to explain you who she is. She's very famous, very influential, a plebeian, Marxist feminist. Then in March, we have Italian philosopher Massimiliano Tomba, who wrote a great book on radical currents in modern revolutions and insurgent universalism. And then in April and in May, we will have two guests from Poland, historian Marta Petrusewicz and her lecture on alternative modernities on peripheries. And the final lecture will be by ethnograph Tomasz Rakowski on his research in Mongolia in neo-pastoral societies. So I think that a lot will be going on. So please stay with us and join us in the future. And thank you, Marcus, once again.